Good evening, everyone. That's loud. You can all take your seats. I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of a break over there. I welcome you. Is this too loud? It's nice to see so many here. And it's beginning to get a little cold. I hope they could turn the heat down a little bit tonight, because it was cold when we got here. Now it's a little bit warm though. So I welcome you all, those here in person and the ones that are home and Zoom. I want to thank Frank Furtado for sponsoring this lecture in memory of his dear wife, Barbara Carr Furtado. And this is incredible. This is Frank's fourth lecture that he has sponsored. And yeah, and he's at home, I hope. As always, I welcome our museum members and the prospective members, and I'm Deanna Canini, president of the museum. I always want to recognize our board members because they do so much that are here this evening. If they could stand, just so you get to know and you can thank them at some point for all the great work that they do. Thank you. I just want to remind you of a few upcoming events. This year, the museum will be participating in the St. Augustine's St. Mary's Christmas Extravaganza on December 7th, 9 to 4. We'll be selling our ornaments and other, our pins and such, and providing information on the museum to the general community. Then on December 14th, the museum will host its annual Christmas open house at the Interpretive Center from noon to 4:30 with Christmas goodies. And the AOH Men's Singers will add a little bit of a holiday spirit. And the big news, as you probably already know, the Luck of the Irish raffle has returned, and it should appear, if already appeared, in your mailboxes this week. The proceeds from this are so essential and critical to maintaining the museum, the Bonnie Street Cemetery, and the lecture series. Plus, it provides the funding for continued development and enhancement of our exhibits and cataloging of all of our archives. The drawing for the 3,000, 2,000, and 1,000 winners will happen on our March 19th lecture. So good luck to all of you. I also want to give you just a bit of a heads up. The Consulate General of Ireland, who is in Boston, will be visiting us as part of a trip to Rhode Island in early 2025. So she's very interested in meeting people in Newport and enjoying our community here. So most likely we'll have an open house with her, so I'll keep you posted. Now to the main event. Tonight we welcome Dr. Marian Mathison Desrosiers, a native Newporter, an independent scholar with 2 decades of teaching history in public schools, and has had an association with Salve as an adjunct professor in history and the humanities. Also, she is a 2-time Fulbright scholar and has numerous published books. Marian has been with us for 2 previous lectures. Tonight, Dr. Desrosiers is going to tell the story of her parents and the contributions they made to the Newport community, from healthcare and safety to urban development, to instilling appreciation of our heritage, and also to assuring rights for its citizens. So please please join me in welcoming Dr. Desrosiers, a Celtic team.
Thank you, Deanna, and Ann Arnold, and Dan Titus, and of course, Frank Furtado, for supporting this lecture tonight. I wanted to start off by just saying that Ann Arnold last supper was asking me, did I have any other Irish stories to tell? And so I started going back through my mother's scrapbooks. Like Justice Murray's mother kept scrapbooks in the 50s and 60s. Well, my mom did too. And that was when we were growing up. My 2 sisters and I were growing up here in Newport. And then I looked for all her folders from the 70s and the 80s. And I found another story too. Now, we're all 3 of us married by then, and maybe not even around Newport at that point in time. But this couple, Genevieve McGlinchey and Wallace Mathison, were really quite a dynamic duo. And that's what I discovered. So I would like to share that with you tonight. I also found quite a few interesting things in the Newport collection at the Newport Public Library. and newspapers.com. I'm going to start off by looking a little bit at Celtic heritage of Genevieve. And the McGlincheys were in Inishowen, the northernmost peninsula of the Republic of Ireland, and the county is Donegal. And when they left in the famine in 1847 to 1850, all the brothers and sisters came over to either Cambridge or to Boston and started to work, to save money for their children to go to school. One of them was Eliza McGowan McGlinchey, who ran a boarding house. And some of you saw Hesea Diener last week, a couple of weeks ago. And she wrote a really great book on that role of Irish women running boarding houses and teaching other Irish women to become domestic servants. They saved their money, the men and the women, to get their kids through parochial school and then through public high school. The folks left by way of Moville and came to Liverpool and then to Cambridge after that. Menandecahala in Ireland, in Donegal, was the ancient homestead, one room of the initial couple that was ancestors of our parents. And that's compared to the beautiful home on the right, three-decker, that was in Cambridge and Harvard Square that they lived in the 1860s. Genevieve's immigrant grandfather became a bookbinder for the Riverside Press, and hence he had some money that he built this house, and it's right across from St. Paul's Catholic Church in Cambridge. Genevieve, as a child, had a lot of very, very wonderful things happen for her, I think. Toe dancing, Irish step dancing lessons. She had lessons in elocution and banjo. At Cambridge Latin, Genevieve excelled in both history and science, debate team, and she was really fast on her mother's Remington typewriter. She played in the orchestra in 1924. And a senior by the name of Leroy Anderson composed music for the group. She lost her father at the age of 50 to a heart attack during her senior year at Radcliffe in 1932, which of course was the height of the Depression. So she was left to be the breadwinner for her mother, her aunt, and her two younger sisters. Her role gave her a toughness to provide for others. While the school committee appointed her to teach at Cambridge Latin, she pursued her master's in physics at Boston College. She had her first really great job at Radiation Laboratory, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where they were looking for both men and women who were, in quotes, intelligent, energetic, and young, end quote. Mathisons came from the highlands of Scotland, near the Kyle of Loch Halse. They were farmers and herders, and in the early 1800s, they were among the exiles due to the Highland clearances, when the open common land was blocked to former tenants, and they were evicted. They moved south to Glasgow, and then eventually to America. On the left is a very famous picture. I think anybody who's been to Scotland has seen this, the Eilean Donnan Castle. And it was the Mathisons who assisted the MacDonalds in building that castle. Wallace was named after a very famous Scottish hero, William Wallace. The Mathisons arrived in America by 1851, and some of them were molders of silver, and others were quarry diggers. They found good jobs along the Connecticut River, and they helped start St. John's Catholic Church in Middletown. Wallace's Irish grandparents were Mary and Patrick Gaffney from Galway. Wallace's youth was among the many cousins of his Irish and Polish families. When his mother tested positive for tuberculosis in 1918, his father took her the 400-mile round trip by their auto. Again, amazing, 1918. He built his own auto. The kits came out of Waltham, Massachusetts. I don't know how many know that, but you could make your own car. And they drove to St. Joseph's Oratory, where Brother Andre was creating miracles, curing people. He's now Saint Andre Bisset. But Brother Andre told them that he wasn't able to cure her, to pray to St. Joseph. So Anna lived another 5 years, and she even went to the Wallingford Sanatorium, the one Gaylord Farm that Eugene O'Neill was at the same time. He was cured, but she did not. So he was 10 when she died. As a result of tuberculosis in the family, when my parents were looking at the 60s and what they could do for testing of tuberculosis of Newport school children, that became very important to both of them. My dad, as a teen, lived in Windsor, Vermont, and he became a downhill skier, a mountain climber, an angler, and he built his own canoe. Wallace graduated from high school in Wilson, North Carolina, and first went to Loyola in Baltimore, hoping to be a physician. He transferred to Boston College, and he ended up majoring in chemistry undergraduate and master's in physics, and then went to radiation lab. So the two of them met through the Boston College Alumni Council and a dance that was held. A lot of dances during the 40s. Joined in holy matrimony at Christmas time in 1944. The couple started their collaboration, common goals, and a constructive interaction that would continue until the unexpected passing of Wallace decades later. So at MIT, my dad's work was with airborne beacons and radar. Mom's group worked on the magnetron and microwaves. As radiation lab closed at the end of the war, they had the opportunity to head west to China Lake, California, where there was a naval ordnance test station called Knots. Dad was working on the Sidewinder missile. Wasn't called that until the 1950s, but that was his work. And Genevieve worked at the Michelson lab doing calculations and directed the science program K through 8. They lived with 10,000 civilians at the little city that you see there on the left-hand side of the page. It was a Navy base in the desert of Death Valley. And that was the largest base in the world at the time, the size of the state of Rhode Island. 6 years at China Lake allowed the couple in their little cubby trailer to travel throughout the West into national parks, fishing, rock hounding, hiking. In 1951 ended that first chapter of their lives. When they drove east in their 1938 Cadillac, that's another story. They went west and east themselves in the 40s, all the way south out to the West Coast and then north coming back. Amazing. When my mother married my father, she knew it was going to be an adventure, but what an adventure, little city girl there. Both parents had a job ahead of time when they came back here in the East. They were hired as physicists at the newly opened Naval Underwater Ordnance Station in Newport, Rhode Island, NUOS. Testing and evaluating torpedoes was their job. Genevieve was the first woman physicist hired at the Navy base. And she was paid the same for her GS rating as the men were, $4,600 for that first year. Here we see on the left the Gould Island testing station, where my mother spent many years evaluating the passive torpedoes. The image on the right is of our ranch house on Coggeshall Avenue, which was a street of gardeners' cottages and mansion stables and our very own fire station. That's our Woody in the driveway and my grandfather's Chevy. Newport life. We three girls enjoyed island life like sailing, ice skating, outdoors at St. George's, gladding dance school, and I heard my Sheila Winters is here, my teacher. It was just so amazing. Horseback riding at Sandy Point, Rocky Farms, Girl Scout camp. Oh, Mom was a Girl Scout leader too. Okay. I suggest at the onset of this talk that Genevieve and Wallace were very unusual. This Celtic team was unique in a number of ways. Both of them had degrees in science, chemistry undergraduate and physics graduate. Genevieve had been working, again, as a woman, very unusual, for 20 years already when they came to Newport. And she was paid her own salary. Without being in politics or an officer in the military or a professor or a superintendent of schools, you didn't get that kind, or a judge, as her friend Judge Murray was, you didn't get that kind of salary or recognition. And that was different. Also, I will argue that the community leaders, like my parents, had vision, talent, and innovation. But leadership requires workers in the field. And there were plenty of times that they bent down and did the work that had to be done. And so began the new decades, nearly 40 years of community service by Celtic couple. I'm going to look at several different areas, and this first one is an education of the community, joining the PTA. They are very integral to the science fairs in the island and to the Newport Engineering Society. Now, these little brochures may seem very strange to all of us when we look at them, but this is a lot of what my mother did in the PTA. You had 5 sessions a year. Some of them the children are performing in, but others you're having guest speakers. And the whole idea is to get people to figure out how to do better with their kids, how to get their kids to be reading, and how to work with the child who doesn't want to do this, but the gifted one that you have who does, you know? So while they were working as scientists at NUOS, they both joined the PTA at Carey and Thompson. And why? Quite frankly, because that's how you keep in touch. You have to talk to the teachers, and that's where people met. Genevieve did rise to positions of leadership in each organization, was president of the Quidnig Island PTA. My father attended meetings, but he also stayed with us girls, with the 3 of us girls, and was willing to take on those tasks when she was giving talks up in Providence in the state organization. But her forte was definitely setting those meetings up. Thompson PTA, Sam Kuznets, I don't know if anyone recognizes these names, but Reverend Simmons, Pat Carroll, the principal, Mrs. Tubley, Mrs. Vergadamo, Mrs. Butler, and Joe Weaver. And the thing about the PTA, that particular time period in the 60s, is it's important to the health of Newport community members. They took the major role in rolling out the distribution of Sabine oral polio vaccine. In 1957, Genevieve Mathison was appointed the first woman science department head at Rogers High School. And that meant she also had to advise on the elementary and junior high school program for curriculum, texts, and equipment. Her salary, $7,600, equal to what she had just left behind at the Navy base. Genevieve was happy with being a teacher, especially when you have an outstanding student. And Paul Bamberg was our first Rhode Island Westinghouse scholar, went on to get his PhD and taught 40 years at Harvard. Science students looking at some equipment. What a great chance to have this photo still for our archives. Some of you may recognize the young girl on the left, Vicki Nally, who is Vicki Johnson. Yes, and she went on to become our first Black woman principal, and even today continues to give scholarships to young women and to provide all kinds of ways for the African-American community, people of that heritage, to be able to have a place and a say, special areas of recognition in our community. All of these young people became educators in their own right. One of the other things that she had to do was to run the science fair, which had existed before my mother took over, but it was a big year coming up in 1959, and they had 450 applicants to present their projects using critical thinking, of course, in the scientific method. But life threw a boomerang into the mix. When 2 years into her role as chairman, Jen suffered a concussion falling on the icy sidewalk at Rogers High School in February of 1959. But the show had to go on, the 18th of March, with the largest number ever. So my father jumped in and took over the lead. He said she had organized it so well, and all the chairmen were great, judges, hospitality. He didn't really need to do much, but he saw it through to the finish. Some names of the winners you may recognize: Sandra Flowers, Tom Conrad, Patsy Gleason, John Dugan, Chris Connell, David Cairns, Tom Kelly, and Janie Newberry. At this point, it's accurate to say that the 1959 concussion had a transformative effect on Genevieve. It would take over a year for her to be able to read again. The accident would be life-changing in that she had finished all of her work, all of her coursework for her doctorate in education at Boston College, and she was all but her dissertation. She was hoping, of course, to become a superintendent of schools. So after 30 years of working and having a salary, she did not return to full-time career. Instead, she gave her energies to Newport from the 1960s on. One of the organizations that my parents belonged to was the Newport Engineering Society. My father was president, vice president, every major leadership position in that organization. And my mother was the secretary at some point towards the late 60s. But here you got an idea of what they did for young people in the community. They honored young boys and young girls who were outstanding in biology, physics, chemistry, any area of science, and gave them an honorary membership in the Newport Engineering Society. They also raised money, and for the first time you had young women going into science with some money to help them out. The other thing they did was my mother's forte, coming up with who to talk and where, what to talk about. And these are some of the topics, really a diverse number of topics. And they would have these more than once a year. But I just picked out a number of these topics. The next area that we're going to look at is compassion or charity. And this is an area that is very typical, I want to say again, of the 50s and even the 60s. Moms and dads were very much into helping out the church, helping out the needy through various organizations. So my father was a Knight of Columbus. So if you can picture this with his black cape and his plumed hat and his sword, his saber, at his side. This was an honor guard, usually for the bishop or special masses. But the Knights of Columbus also provided insurance for families, monetary relief for immigrants, and promoted Catholic education. As a member of the Junipero Serra Club, which met at Salve Regina, the men raised money for young men to go into the seminary. He was also a member of the Fathers' Council at Salve Regina, which was a fundraising, and also set up the Father-Daughter Weekend. Having served as a race committee chairman at the Newport Yacht Club for 10 years, my dad was instrumental in getting the Salve Regina Sailing Club, which we started in 1967 when I was there. The use of those little turnabouts as our dinghies to practice for intercollegiate circuit races between 1967 and 1972. So Betsy and I both had that opportunity. St. Augustine's on Harrison Avenue was the Catholic parish. And while my father was on the financial council, my mother joined the other women in the St. Augustine's Guild, and they raised money for all sorts of charities and different situations where people, particularly young women who might be in need, unwed mothers, would have some benefit. So my mother's participation on the Catholic Daughters and in the Guild with the other mothers helping out promoted her to a position in the Diocesan Council of Catholic Women. And so she went on to assist in their many projects, anti-poverty programs, immigrant family programs. And finally, in terms of charity and friendship, she was a member, and I thank Kathy DeUlias and Catherine Brady. I don't know, I've never met Catherine Brady, but she gave me a number of wonderful sources on the AOH. And my mother was the president from 77 to 78, went to Killarney for the international conference. But she was a member until 2001. So she definitely dedicated to that group of young and older women. Urban renewal. Slum clearance. We're going to go into the next section where they move away from education, schools, and we're going to see a wider swath of activity going on here. The Redevelopment Agency in Newport, again, something from the dark ages, right, 1960s, had a whole plan of what to do with the downtown area. And so West Broadway, half the houses there were not to code. Long Wharf had 15 empty businesses. So something happened to, you have to do something with that area. Goat Island and the Causeway, the Navy had given up the torpedo station, so we bought it. The city bought it and built the Causeway. And America's Cup Avenue, a connector between one area and the other. One of the things about that, and I thank former Commodore Pam Barter for telling me this, was that the Newport Yacht Club was on the land of Parati Park. It had to be moved. So they hoisted it over and put it on its present day site. But that was a plan for that area to have the cruise ships, ferries, all land there. And then there was Historic Hill, and that's the area my parents were involved in, was Historic Hill. I just put down the bridge and the library at the same time because all of that was happening here. The bridge was built by the General Assembly, and we had a great group of people who realized if you could get federal money to build the library on Spring Street, part of Historic Hill, then you should do it. And so that's what they did. There were several organizations that my parents became involved in, and each of these had their own benefits, they had their own area that they were looking at. Point Association had actually existed as Old Port since 1928, but they branched out and they published a green light quarterly letter or journal so that people would know more about what was going on. And they also had a plan, which they gave to the city before the city voted on the final plan. They wanted mostly to keep anything under 1850. And there were 60 families that were slated to lose their houses. So the Point Association was fighting for that. My parents joined them in that to try and help that out. The next group was Operation Clapboard, and established in 1963 with Richard Sheffield and Nadine Pepys. What they wanted to do was to try and find ways to save houses, but they would buy them first or put money out there and try and give you a loan for the houses. So not that my parents did that, they didn't do it that way, but they joined the Clapboard organization. My dad served on the directors of the Clapboard, and they also bought a house. So what you see here on the left is 199 Spring Street, which still exists, painted black, awful. But they bought this house, and it was confiscated from Thomas Bannister, who was a loyalist. He was the brother of John, who lives catty corner at 56 Pelham. And it was given to an armorer, John Kerber, who had changed sides and joined the American forces in the Battle of Rhode Island. So he lived there first in that period of time. So what we did was we, children, daughters, were commandeered to go in and help my parents on this house. It was a beautiful house inside, 2-foot wide floorboards almost throughout, right up to the top 3rd floor. Walls that once we took all the wallpaper down off of them, had cow hair and shells in the wall. And we kind of left it that way, painted it white so you could see it. There was a beautiful fan light over the doorway that was multicolored, and it had coins on the side of the building. We called them corner coins. It was a Peter Harrison style, and Peter Harrison was the brother-in-law of John Bannister. So who knows, maybe it was put on there. But you see the little sign there that's on the house? That was one of those famous acorn signs for Operation Clapboard. So one of the things that Operation Clapboard did was to do the history of the house so that you knew that it was genuine, that you had an authentic colonial home, and you put that sign up. So in the first year, Operation Clapboard saved 28 houses from destruction, either on Thames Street, the Point, or Historic Hill. But by 1974, they already had saved over 50. So it wasn't a long period of time that they were in operation, but they did their best. They did not compete, obviously, with Doris Duke and the Restoration Foundation. So looking at that picture on the right, you see that's a brochure for a house tour. And one of the things that they became very famous for, the Operation Clapboard, is to have people open up their houses and show them for what can be done to make it a place where a modern family could actually live. And so this kind of organization really showed their wares, what they had done during those summer house tours. And there were many people, including my sisters, who led the house tour through our house on 199 Spring Street. Picture on the left is my parents at work inside that house with the final color of all the walls and the wainscoting, which was a bayberry color. They were also founders of the Hill Association and helped to write the Constitution and bylaws for that group. The Hill Association involved one place, and I'll show you a map in a minute of Historic Hill, but this is the first newsletter. And you'll see that in the lower right corner, there's a picture of Frank Lane going on up towards Trinity Church. That was one of them that was destroyed and made into part of Queen Anne Square. And that's going to be the last on that. This is Historic Hill. And if I can share with you, so this is the 1970s. So anyone who had a house that was Victorian or colonial, they had kind of a buy on life here for their house because it was part of this historic hill. So it started over here at Truro, went up to School, Division Street, on up to John Street, Bellevue, William Street, Golden Hill, down to Brewer, and encompassed all of these wharfs on the waterfront, with the main emphasis being Bowen and Bannister, which is today, what we have is kind of like the main, although Hammett really is pretty neat right now with what they did with that, which was a commercial wharf. There was one other one, Meeting House, and this was an attempt by Ward Harvey and Richard Sheffield, two incredibly great men in the history of this whole era of redevelopment who tried to save things. And they put together a package to try and get this ancient church, 1735, of Reverend Ezra Stiles, to be saved. And it was falling apart. St. Joseph's owned it at the time, but they really didn't get enough money. It was going to cost $80,000 to rebuild the whole thing. So even though it looks like in the picture that you had Ed Conley, Bob McKenna, and Antoinette Downing putting a plaque on it, yes, we finally got it and we're going to save this building. It was bought by someone and turned into condos. So it didn't always happen happily. And there were, the waterfront area, 67 families lost their homes or buildings were bulldozed. Genevieve and Wallace and cultural celebrations. And so we have this three things: Christmas in Newport, the RICAN, and the Irish Association. So Christmas in Newport really was one of those brainchilds of one person who wanted to kind of recreate a colonial period of time where you went back to very simple things like white lights and single candles in the window, reimagined by Ruth Myers. But a lot of people really enjoyed that whole idea. And the families in the Point, the Weavers, the Bensons, the Covels, oh my gosh, they were really spearheaded that whole movement to make the Point a part of Historic Hill, whereas Dorothea Philibrown was almost like a one-woman show doing it in the Point to begin with. It was non-profit, though. This is everything you had to do was non-profit if you wanted to be in Christmas in Newport. It was not to make money. So my sister told me about this. She remembers my mom would confirm the nonprofit activity requests that came in by phone, and she laid out the December calendar for printing every year. That's how she contributed. But I also got a memory from John Millar, who was on many of these boards when he had a house here in Newport, and he built HMS Rose for the celebration in 1976. One unique event that he recalls, and I quote, "Ruth and Jack Myers and your parents were the 4 M's. They were good friends and pretty much carried the early years of Christmas in Newport. One commemoration of Newport colonial days was the Turtle Frolic of 1752. So we had a musket salute by the artillery company beginning the event. And then we had English country dancing." End quote. Frank Hale, Bob McKenna, Fred Kirby, and John Loth also made sure we had masses in French to celebrate Rochambeau as part of it. So 5 decades later, still going strong, right? Christmas in Newport. The couple was also leaders of the Rhode Island Commemorative. You know, Pat Conley, who gave the books here tonight, he was the overall lead in Rhode Island in 1972 to 1976. But Bob McKenna was the Newport person who organized. They decided to create medallions, and I think my sister and I are both wearing them tonight. These medallions were in silver, bronze, and they sold them as a necklace, or you could get a set of them. And this was to raise money because everybody who participated, Paul Ships, Inc., the Fife and Glum Corps, the Artillery Company, the Black Regiment, everyone had money to provide for the people who needed the costumes or needed whatever. We had to raise the money somehow. So they sold, my 2 parents sold those every time, and my dad was treasurer. A special shout out for the Independence Commemorative and the people who worked on it for the various activities. Larry Newsom, Paul Sullivan, Steve Lepley, people you all know. And I'm not listing everybody, but these are the people who made it happen. And those tall ships coming here and the Independence Ball at Rosecliff. My parents were co-chair, but they couldn't have done it without all of those people. So I talked to Jim Mahoney, who is such a sweet person, in the summer of this past year. And he was telling me how he and Paul Crowley and Rick O'Neill and Rick Kelly got together and they decided to do something more for Irish, and and they put together this organization. And my mother and father just happened to be in La Forge that night. And they said, "What are you guys doing?" And then when they were told, oh, my mother said, "Oh, I'm Boston Irish. I have to join this organization." So they were really instrumental in getting lots of you and others to be part of this whole thing. And the famous calendar, right? Jim said that he recalled that my mother was the one who worked hard on the bus tour, the first bus tour that took you to sites like Rosecliff and Fort Adams, St. Mary's. And she was always there doing the Irish teas also. And Rick Kelly added, and I quote, "Along with your folks, Barbara Booth, Al McAloon, Bob McKenna, Eileen O'Reilly, John Chatty, and so many others, they expanded our vision of awakening Newport to its rich heritage and culture way beyond what we had initially discussed doing," end quote. But we all talked about when Cherish the Ladies, and Robbie O'Connell came to Rogers High School, to that wonderful auditorium that used to exist. Preservation, right? Preservation, maintaining things. 1996, many members moved into our present day organization, which we're so grateful for, Museum of Irish History, and with a broader goal, the Interpretive Center, and lecture series, very happy to be here, all kinds of goals to really have expanded focus. Finally, Genevieve and Wallace in the community, and so many things were they involved in here. TB testing, Red Cross swimming, rights of way. All right. So the TB testing, you heard why this was something dear to their hearts. My mother had been an officer in the Rhode Island Lung Association also, and came down with this idea. And then they had the tine testing, which are the little prongs that you put in, 4 little prongs, and you can tell in 48 hours if you've been exposed to TB. So they had a way to do it. And they had a crew, Geraldine Nagel, Mildred McDonald, Paula Donovan, and Agnes Sullivan. Those are your key people that helped start this whole thing off. It went on for to 73, so 12 years. They tested about between 1,800 and 2,000 students a year. And if you were an adult, you could go to Washington Square, Park Home, or the Bellevue Shopping Center, and you could also be tested for that. And then follow-ups with x-rays and all of that. There was also Red Cross swimming. My parents at the time in the 50s were working at the base, and they asked the base commander, because my father had this thing, he said, like, in quote, "How do we live near the water and not insist that Newport's children learn how to swim? End quote. So the base commander said yes. And he gave over the swimming pool 7 to 9 Wednesday nights for 9-week sessions, 3 a year, with kids not just from Newport, but whole county, Little Compton, Tiverton, Ruth Earl, Barbara Chapman, Everett Woods, Thelma Grennan, Joe Sigerson, Roger Caswell, great swimming instructors. 3,000 young people were taught to swim better through that program. The American Red Cross, most of you know that importance. We have FEMA now, though, right? So we don't have to worry, but blood bank, the hurricane assistance, hospital volunteers, water safety, and boating safety. So my mother and Charlie Donovan taught first aid to police, firefighters, high school students who plan to be lifeguards and swimming instructors, and Girl Scout leaders. There was also boating safety classes. The rights of way. It all began at Bailey's Beach. And I'll share a little bit about this. This is a very complicated issue. If you look at this map and look carefully, you will see that Bellevue Avenue ended right into the beach. At one time, that was the right of way. So you see, they have a little, see where the fence goes across here? That was not, it went, this is Bellevue Avenue, it went right into the beach. That was the right of way. Well, the problem with that for this beach association was that people wandered onto the beach and into the bathhouses and anywhere they wanted to onto private property. So they put up a fence. So you can understand what they're thinking. You know, we've got to protect our property and our people. They put up a fence, but then there were people on Coxhill Avenue who had a right of way to that beach. So 83 people signed a petition, and Patrick O'Neill Hayes and Ed Oakley took their side and said, no, they have to open that beach back up to them. Fishermen, cliff walkers. Yeah, so it finally was settled in 1970 by a kind of swap of land. And we all know that is still a problem. It solved it in one way, but created its own problem in other ways. We all know about the Coastal Resource Management Council, still exists all those years later. They're the ones who are supposed to monitor this kind of control so that private citizens don't have to go after it, right? So my parents joined the Fifth Ward Improvement Association, which they didn't found it, not like Historic Hill, but in 1973 it had been founded, and they joined in 77 to do these kinds of things. I don't know if anybody here remembers the problems with sewage going into the bay and people trying to swim in King Park that had oil on them. Yes, there were some definite problems, and the Fifth Ward Improvement Association tried to solve those. And again, you might remember some of those people: Donato DeAndrea, Charlie Donovan, Tom Saseki, Wayne Krause, Helen McLeish, Robin Morse. My mom served as secretary for 10 years. My dad served in all kinds of leadership positions in that organization, hoping to solve a number of these problems. It was very difficult. And the wharfs, a number of them were blocked off with gates and locks. And maybe it was good because some of them had some pretty awful stuff on them. Waits Wharf had been a mobile station for years, and there were tanks that were being filled. You know, there was the lead shot company and Richmond Manufacturing on Howard Waste that left, you know, waste too. We had a coal yard on one of those, a Newport coal yard. So the difficulties with all of these meant antagonisms in the community because there are some people here who had very vested interests But for my parents, it was the contaminants, the chemicals, because that was their background. And they wanted to know what was the city going to do. So the letter, the types information on the left is my mother's secretarial notes about everything they've been doing. And on the right, the final solution, which is nobody listened. City solicitor, city manager, mayor, town council. Yeah. So my parents tried to join forces with a little bit more power to it, or organization just been formed in 1982. So they joined with Mary Ferrazzoli and Vic Farmer and some of these other folks who were looking at more than just those wharfs on the south side near Kings Park. They were looking at the entire waterfront, and they were looking at the Cliff Walk, and they were looking at Washington Street to find out what could we do. We have to, there's all this stuff going on, which is people being paid under the table. And I want to tell you, I dug up things that were not really good. I can't share with you everything I found from this research, but it was not pretty. Eventually, after 1982 to 87, and my mother testifying, and Vic Farmer actually said to me when I interviewed him, he said that my mother would do all of the legwork and get all of the concrete facts down for all these waterfront properties, and would sit next to Mary Ferrazzoli and would have all this data so that she could maps and everything, and she could offer it as testimony. Eventually, though, that council shut ordinary citizens down, and you had to be a lawyer in order to testify before that council. But they did get these rights of way. So the ones they had been arguing about on the Fifth Ward Improvement Association, north to south, Brown and Howard Wharf and Lee Wharf, Howard Wharf, Spring Wharf, West Extension, and Waits Wharf, they all were determined to be correctly rights of way of the city. The city had never given them up. They were owned by us, the citizens. So those all had to open up. By 1997, they finally put these plaques in the streets of Newport. And these are the medallions. Now, people may have macadammed over them, but they were placed at the beginning and the end of every right of way in Newport. And there were 12 of them on the rights of way on Washington Street. Nobody could block those off. You could put your dinghies on those driftways. Those are rights of way to the city. And then from Seaview to Ledge Road, there are also these medallions that were placed there that we had never given up. No one who had a mansion on the Cliff Walk in those places could close it off to us. So the last thing here is the schools. And my mother was 70 when she was appointed to take Dave Carlin's last year on the school committee. She served all the way while she was elected again, and she served in 86 to 90 and then on to 94 into her 80s. Her mantra in running for office as a septuagenarian, and I quote, "It isn't age, it's experience. You support the contract you make with the teachers. You spend taxpayer dollars on reading, writing, and arithmetic at all levels and for all students. Communicate and empower parents to contribute," end quote. In 1988, my father died way too soon. They really were quite a couple. And my mom had 16 more years to be out there writing her letters to the editor, which she did monthly. And even going down, I went with her, went in 2001 to the town council and she gave her piece on Waits Wharf that night. These two people, what kind of people were they? They loved adventures. They loved Newport. My sister and later with the 7 grandkids, hopping on the station wagon, heading boogie boarding at Easton Beach, fishing at Fort Adams, crabbing at Green End Beach, painting at the Art Association, taking environmental science at the Norman Bird Sanctuary, the summer programs of reading at Newport Library, sailing out of Newport Yacht Club. On Bill Nagel's boat is what the race committee boat was when my dad was there. Special times included breakfast at the Bellevue Avenue Creamery. Oh, would we love that back again? After Sunday Mass, song night at LaForge, which I heard still continues Friday, and he still plays the Irish songs and others. And all you can eat shrimp and mussels on Friday nights at the pier. My parents, Jen and Wally, were quite frankly larger than life. They complemented each other, and when one became strong-willed, the other knew how to support with flexibility. Each of them had an intellectual grasp of the issues and had a vision of what needed to be done. Jointly, they researched and worked to accomplish those goals. My dad, Wally, was kind, gentle, and giving. He accomplished what needed to be done quietly, without seeking headlines. It is fair to say that Genevieve never shied away from controversy or communicating her visions. She was definitely interested in public speaking and writing letters. She was democracy writ large, but then again, she had more years. What a team they were for 4 decades. Wally had a generous spirit, love for life, respect for others, and a ready hand as well as a ready smile. And Genevieve, with her incredible memory, integrity, and devotion to family, was ever young at heart. Yet both were intelligent, sincere, and driven in achieving goals for the Newport community, using evidence to resolve problems. It's hard to believe all they accomplished. 40 years. They believed that citizens could check the forces of greed over the use of taxpayer dollars. Watch, pay attention to where the money goes, and get involved. My parents would be the first to say that it was a cast of hundreds using their time, talent, and cooperation to make successful outcomes possible for the residents of Newport. In all of these areas, education, charity, culture, historic preservation, and community issues. In their life's work, they sailed through storms and sunshine, steady on the tiller. They kept their faith in God, in themselves, in their Celtic heritage, and in the Newport community of fellow citizens, and in our American values. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes. Is that Patrick? Patrick Shea? He lives
Was
down-
your mother on the city council around 1970? Newport?
It's not on my, Pat,
The question was she ever on city council?
was she on the city? Yeah.
School committee, she was.
Newport City Council.
Was your mother a city council?
No,
That's better.
yeah, I did do it. Yeah,
Just-
she's on school committee though. Yeah, school committee for 10 years.
Is this
In
one
her
working?
70s to
Can you
80s.
Can you recognize your sisters?
Yes, my 2 sisters, Sally, you got here right here.
Right here? Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. And I'm sure you're here for a few minutes if anyone else wants to ask you some questions personally. Thank you very much for coming. Happy holidays. I'll see you in Zoom in January, February, and live in March. All right. Enjoy. Thank you.